gospel lesson is found in John chapter 20, beginning with verse number 19. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them, although the doors were shut. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. May God bless the reading and hearing of this word. May we hear in it a word that is from God, that is to us, and that is for us on this day. I believe that I have shared with you that my older brother also went into church work as an organist and choir director just outside of Atlanta. I have occasionally consulted him when wrestling with ideas about worship, and I found him to be helpful most of the time. Once the church I was pastoring was tinkering with its worship service, contemplating changing the style of music and anthems that the choir sang on Sunday mornings. We had a long-standing pattern of singing mostly traditional kinds of things, which they were quite good at. But in the hope of attracting a broader spectrum of people, some of the staff and members of the worship committee began to discuss the possibility of incorporating some very contemporary forms of worship and anthems into the service. No one wanted to make a full commitment to this contemporary music, so we flirted with the idea of mixing it up. Some Sundays we would stick with the traditional stuff, which we were accustomed, and then some Sundays we would switch it over to the contemporary option. Now, I was a bit hesitant about it, but the proponents of the idea were very, very convincing. But before I offered him a full blessing, I called my big brother in Atlanta, the musician, and I explained to him what I just explained to you. And then there was silence on the phone for just a few seconds, and he said, "That sounds like a great idea. That sounds like a great idea if you want to make half your congregation mad every Sunday." He actually used much more colorful language, which isn't appropriate for this setting. You see, it's generally known that church musicians use much saltier language than us innocent preacher types. I discovered he was right after a month of implementing the plan, and discovered that, in fact, half the congregation was mad every week, depending on which form we were using that week. And about a month is about as long as that idea lasted. I do try to learn from my mistakes, and that experience with the botched music venture taught me a lesson. It's bad practice to make half your congregation mad every week. And so, having learned that lesson, I'm going to attempt to make all of you mad in the spirit of fairness. Let's see what I can do. I'm trying to make you all mad with just two statements. First, social justice work without Jesus is simply social justice work. And there's nothing wrong with social work, and the work that various types of social workers do is important. But if it is removed from the spirit and the teaching of Jesus, then it is simply a secular form of social work. Important for sure, but it isn't the business of the church which bears Christ's name. I know I've got Mission, Peace, and Justice upset. Maybe half of you are mad. Let me get to the rest of it. Jesus, without social justice work, isn't the Jesus we encounter in the Gospels. Jesus, without social justice work, isn't the Jesus who had more to say about the poor and our responsibility to them than he had to say about nearly anything else. Jesus, without social justice work, isn't the Jesus who devoted practically the entirety of his ministry to reaching out to the marginalized and the oppressed. So, hopefully, you're all upset now. My point is really that the tension which sometimes exists within community living in the church, that the tension that exists between an emphasis on social justice work and the empowering of people through the teachings and the spirit of Jesus is a tension that need not exist. Because when it comes to this tension between social justice work and the building up and empowerment of people through the teachings and spirit of Jesus, it isn't an either or. It is a both and. And in fact, better put, it is a whole lot of both and a whole lot of and. With that as a backdrop, let's approach our text. But before we do, let me say a word or two more about the inspiration for this sermon. Today is April the 16th, and we read this morning a portion of the letter that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from the Birmingham jail. That was written 60 years ago today. It was written in response to a letter printed in the Birmingham News, which was credited to 8 clergy members who urged Dr. King and his followers to ease up. They were causing too much commotion in Birmingham, too much turbulence. So while sitting in a jail cell because of his participation in one of those demonstrations, King wrote that letter on the margins of newspaper scraps until he finished it on a yellow legal pad that somebody slipped into his cell. In short, it was a scathing rebuke of the churches who wished to sit inside their stained glass windows while ignoring the life and death struggle of the poor and black people who lived in Birmingham. It was a rebuke of the choice of moderate churches to remain silent when its voice was needed the most. Now, we have a very natural entry into our text, which opens with these words describing the nature of the post-resurrection church. It was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear. So if we imagine that immediately after the resurrection it all came together and that the church felt emboldened and empowered, and that they were out there telling the world their message, we would be wrong. We find them instead locked inside a room, fearful and silent. It was an interesting character who broke the silence. The first voice to speak in this passage besides Jesus is Thomas. Thomas, who is famous in the story for his doubt, although I would suggest that he was a lot more than just a doubter. One of my favorite references to Thomas happens just a few chapters earlier in John's Gospel when Jesus informs his followers that he's going to Jerusalem, where those who wish him dead are waiting for him to show his face. Well, the disciples put two and two together and knew that if they didn't like Jesus, they weren't going to like his followers much either. So again, there's silence in the scene. And then it is Thomas who breaks the silence, saying, "Come, let's go to Jerusalem and die with him." Whenever I think about that, I think on the one hand, how good it would be to be a friend like that, and on the other, how good it would be to have a friend like that. Thomas' name, when translated, means twin, and yet we are never introduced to Thomas's twin in the story. Some believe, and I might follow this path with them, that John, who was really big into symbolism, that he did this intentionally, so that we would all identify ourselves as Thomas' twin, people full of both faith and doubt. Scholar and pastor Nancy Rockwell says this about Thomas in this passage: sitting next to every true believer in the Easter pew is a doubter whose presence is dedicated to unanswered questions and perhaps to the love of someone who has no doubt, which is why doubting Thomas was in that room. He belonged to the group, those who believed, those who said they believed but didn't, and those who had questions but were afraid to pipe up. Churches and communities of believers, she wrote, aren't just people who are believers. They are places where people gather who have questions, who doubt, who hope, who come to find something out. And it is in that context that Thomas, in the midst of the silence, he pipes up. He speaks. He breaks the silence. That's who Thomas is. Being his twin might not be a terrible thing at all. Now, it would be sorely tempting for us in a church like ours, when we think about the sounds of silence, when we think about that letter from the Birmingham jail, to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, and maybe a little bit of that is okay because we're rarely silent around here, right? We speak to these matters. But I would ask that we resist the temptation toward that approach, lest we close our hearts and minds to the presence of Christ's Spirit, which empowers us to do the social justice work which is unique to the church which bears Christ's name. So resisting the temptation toward pride, we might be better served by remembering. Try this with me. Remembering some times when we were silent, when we should have spoken. When I was growing up, we lived in 12 different places in my first 14 years of life because of my father's vocation. We would move. My brother and I would begin once again that process of getting to know people, trying somehow to get on the inside, trying somehow to find our place. When I was 15, I had been in a new school for about a year. Still struggling to find my place, but I made a small collection of friends. And one day in a science class, I was sitting with that collection of friends, and a boy named David Woodland was sitting a row or two in front of us. And my friends began to take small pieces of chewing gum from their mouth and throw it at his hair. Now, I was only 15, but my parents had never let there be any question about how wrong those kinds of things are. But I was afraid to speak that truth. I was afraid that I was already on thin ice as the new guy, and afraid that, like David, I could end up permanently on the outside. I even laughed a little along with them, I'm ashamed to say. But the thing I didn't do was to speak up. And I still think about that young man then, who is still my age now. I wonder what those terrible days in high school were like for him. And I remember my silence when I had a chance to speak up for him. I remember the early days of my ministry, when the church was beginning to grapple with its deplorable treatment of the LGBT community. I remember serving in this big, beautiful, moderate church with a big salary and a lot of comfort and a promising future. I remember how well gay and lesbian members of that congregation were treated, as long as nobody asked and nobody told. I remember pushing and prodding that church to move forward, to move beyond that. I remember preaching sermons which were only bold enough to make them smile and laugh when they said, "That's Phil, he's our liberal preacher." But when it came time to dig my heels into the ground, to draw a line and to say enough is enough, half measures and this patronizing tolerance won't do. When that time came, for too long I was silent. Until, and I promise you this is true, the Spirit of Christ wouldn't let me be silent anymore. But it took that Spirit to give me a voice. So you see, I do remember. I remember what it is to be silent. And I remember the cost of silence. It does us good to remember when we were silent. That way we never stop seeking the living presence of Christ, the Spirit which can embolden us to pipe up when it's time. The most important words of this passage are spoken by Jesus when he enters the room, and 3 times these words are spoken. Peace be with you. And with that, the Spirit of Christ, which breaks the silence and gives the church a voice, was given. To that fearful and silent group of believers, Jesus said, "Peace be with you." And at that they received the Spirit. The Spirit which would no longer allow them to live locked up in that room full of fear or to remain silent. The Spirit which would give them the courage they would need and would give them the voice they would need. They received the Spirit which broke the silence into pieces. They received that Spirit which would empower them and will empower us too. In the words of John Wesley, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. May God send that Spirit. Let it hover over us. Let it live within us. Let it be our guide. Let it give us voice. Let it embolden us. Let it empower us. Let it encourage us. Let it make of us a church with a voice. Voice worthy of being heard. Amen.